During my sophomore year of college, I was desperately searching for a way to make ends meet. Textbooks weren't going to buy themselves, and my diet of ramen noodles was getting old fast. That's when I stumbled upon a job listing for a night shift receptionist at a small hotel in the mountains of New Mexico. The pay wasn't great, but it promised plenty of quiet time for studying. Little did I know, I was about to step into a world of unexplainable horrors that would change my life forever. The Whisper Pines Hotel was a far cry from the luxury resorts you'd find in bigger cities. It was a weathered two-story building with faded yellow paint peeling off its wooden exterior. The windows seemed to stare out at the surrounding forest like weary eyes, and the front porch creaked ominously with every step. But beggars can't be choosers, and when the owner, Mrs. Blackwood, offered me the job on the spot, I couldn't say no. Mrs. Blackwood was an enigma from the start. She was a tall, slender woman with silver hair always pulled back in a tight bun. Her eyes were a piercing green that seemed to look right through you. Despite her advanced age, she moved with a grace that was almost unsettling. She gave me a brief tour of the hotel, explaining my duties in a voice that was surprisingly deep and melodious for someone her age. My first few weeks at Whisper Pines were uneventful. The hotel didn't get many guests, mostly hikers and nature enthusiasts drawn to the vast wilderness surrounding us. I checked them in, hand over their keys, and spend the rest of my shift buried in my textbooks. The quiet nights were perfect for studying, broken only by the occasional creak of the old building settling or the distant howl of a coyote. But then, things started to get weird. It began with small oddities that were easy to dismiss. I'd returned from a quick bathroom break to find items in the lobby had moved. The guest book would be on a different table, or the vase of wildflowers would be on the opposite end of the counter. At first, I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness. Maybe I was moving things without realizing it, my mind too focused on memorizing chemical formulas or historical dates. As the weeks went on, the strange occurrences became harder to ignore. I started hearing things. Footsteps echoing from empty hallways, whispers just on the edge of hearing. I'd investigate, heart pounding, only to find vacant corridors and silent rooms. The rational part of my brain tried to explain it away. Old buildings make noise, right? And working nights was probably messing with my perception. But then the guests started noticing things too. One night, a middle-aged man came down to the lobby looking shaken. His face was pale, and his hands trembled as he asked for a cup of coffee. When I inquired if everything was all right, he swore he'd seen someone standing at the foot of his bed, watching him sleep. But when he turned on the light, the figure vanished into thin air. I tried to reassure him it was just a dream, a common occurrence when sleeping in an unfamiliar place. But the look in his eyes told me he didn't believe it any more than I did. That was just the beginning. More guests started checking out early, claiming their rooms felt wrong, or that they'd seen impossible things in the mirrors. Some described feeling like they were being watched, even when alone in their rooms. Others swore they heard voices calling their names from empty corners. Mrs. Blackwood brushed off their concerns with a practiced ease. She'd smile that enigmatic smile of hers and insist it was just the mountain air playing tricks on them. The elevation can do strange things to the mind, she'd say, her green eyes glinting. But I was starting to suspect there was more to it than thin air and overactive imaginations. Driven by a mix of curiosity and growing unease, I started doing some research during my shifts. The hotel's history was murky at best. It had changed hands several times over the decades, with long periods where it stood empty. I uncovered rumors of strange disappearances in the area dating back to the early 1900s. Hikers who ventured into the woods and were never seen again. Guests who checked into hotels in the region, only to vanish without a trace. But it was the local legends that really caught my attention. The indigenous people of the area had stories of skinwalkers, shape-shifting creatures from Native American lore. These beings were said to be able to take on the appearance of animals or other humans. They were feared and respected, known for their powerful magic and often malevolent intentions. I tried to convince myself it was all superstition, just scary stories told around campfires. But the more I learned, the harder it became to dismiss the possibility that there might be some truth to the legends. The unexplained events at the hotel took on a sinister new light. Then, on a particularly quiet night, I saw something that shattered my skepticism for good. I was alone in the lobby, fighting to stay awake as I pored over my biology notes. Movement in the parking lot caught my eye. A figure was crossing the gravel, heading for the woods. Something about its gait seemed off, almost animal-like. It moved with a fluidity that didn't seem quite human. Curiosity overcame my better judgment, and I stepped outside for a better look. The figure paused at the tree line, as if sensing my presence. For a moment, I could have sworn it wasn't human at all. Its limbs were too long, its posture all wrong. Then it turned and looked right at me. I'll never forget those eyes. They glowed in the darkness, filled with an intelligence that was decidedly not human. In that instant, I knew all the stories were true. This was no person, no animal. This was something else entirely. The creature, the Skinwalker, held my gaze for what felt like an eternity. I was frozen in place, unable to move, unable to breathe. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone, melting into the shadows of the forest as if it had never been there at all. I ran back inside, my heart pounding so hard, I thought it might burst from my chest. Part of me wanted to quit on the spot, to never set foot in that hotel again. But a larger part, the part driven by curiosity and a need for answers, kept me coming back night after night. Over the next few weeks, I became hyper-aware of every little detail around me. I started noticing things about our guests that I'd overlooked before. The way certain individuals moved with a fluid grace that seemed just a bit too perfect. How some would stare just a bit too long, as if trying to memorize every feature of my face. The occasional glimpse of inhuman eyes reflected in windows or mirrors, therein gone so fast I could almost convince myself I'd imagined it. I started to wonder how many of our guests were actually skinwalkers in disguise. Were they using the hotel as some kind of base, a meeting point, or was it something even more sinister? The possibilities my mind conjured up kept me awake long after my shifts ended. Mrs. Blackwood's behavior became increasingly suspicious to me. She seemed oblivious to the strange goings-on, always ready with a rational explanation for the inexplicable. But sometimes I'd catch her having hushed conversations with certain guests, exchanges that would stop abruptly when I entered the room. Her green eyes would flash with something. Annoyance? Fear? Before her pleasant mask slipped back into place. One night, driven by a mix of curiosity and mounting dread, I decided to do some snooping. Mrs. Blackwood had stepped out, leaving me alone in the hotel. Heart racing, I snuck into her office, searching for any clues that might explain what was really going on at Whisper Pines. At first glance, the office seemed normal enough. Filing cabinets, a desk covered in paperwork, shelves lined with binders and books on hotel management. But as I dug deeper, I found something that made my blood run cold. Hidden in the bottom drawer of her desk, beneath a false bottom, I discovered an old leather-bound book. Its cover was worn and decorated with strange symbols that made my eyes hurt to look at directly. With shaking hands, I opened it. The pages were filled with more of those bizarre symbols, alongside drawings that turned my stomach. They depicted creatures that looked like twisted versions of humans and animals, caught in various stages of transformation. Rituals were described in a language I couldn't read, but the accompanying illustrations left little doubt as to their dark nature. I realized with growing horror that I was holding a skinwalker's grimoire, a book of their secrets and magic. This was proof that not only were skinwalkers real, but Mrs. Blackwood was intimately involved with them. Before I could process what I'd found, I heard footsteps approaching. Panic seized me as I shoved the book back in its hiding place and rushed out of the office. I had barely made it back to the lobby when Mrs. Blackwood rounded the corner. She fixed me with a suspicious look, her green eyes seeming to pierce right through me. "Is everything all right, dear?" she asked, her voice as smooth as ever. "You look a bit flushed." I mumbled something about the heating being too high and hurried back to my post at the front desk. But I could feel her eyes on me, watching, assessing. In that moment, I knew that my life at Whisper Pines had just become a lot more complicated and dangerous. From that point on, I felt like I was being watched constantly. Not just by the skinwalkers I now suspected were posing as guests, but by Mrs. Blackwood herself. She started asking pointed questions about my schedule, my plans after graduation. It felt like she was trying to determine if I was a threat to whatever was really going on at the hotel. I knew I had to be careful. If my suspicions were correct, I was in way over my head. These creatures were ancient, powerful, and clearly had some connection to the hotel that went beyond a simple business arrangement. I was just a college kid working the night shift, way out of my depth in a world I barely understood. But I couldn't just walk away. Not when I knew what was really lurking in the shadows of Whisper Pines. I felt a responsibility to uncover the truth, to maybe even find a way to stop whatever nefarious plans the skinwalkers had. I started keeping a journal, documenting everything strange I witnessed. The guests who checked in but were never seen leaving. The ones who seemed to change appearance subtly over the course of their stay. The inexplicable sounds and sights that plagued the hotel at night. One entry stands out in my memory, a night that still gives me chills when I think about it. A woman had checked in, claiming to be a wildlife photographer working on a book about the local fauna. She was strikingly beautiful, with long dark hair and piercing green eyes that reminded me uncomfortably of Mrs. Blackwood's. But something about her set me on edge from the moment she walked in. Later that night, I was doing my usual rounds when I heard a commotion from her room. It sounded like furniture being overturned, followed by a strange, guttural growl that raised the hair on the back of my neck. Concerned, I knocked on the door. When there was no answer, I used my master key to enter. The room was in disarray, but empty of any people. The window was wide open, curtains billowing in the cool night breeze. On the floor lay a pile of clothes, the same ones the woman had been wearing earlier, and on the bed was a clump of long dark hair. As I stood there, trying to make sense of the scene, I heard a howl from the woods. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard before. It was almost human, but distorted, as if the sound was being made by a throat not designed for such noises. I slammed the window shut and ran back to the lobby, my mind racing. Had I just witnessed the aftermath of the skinwalker transformation? The thought made my skin crawl and my stomach churn. The incidents continued to escalate after that night. Guests would report seeing their own doppelgangers wandering the halls, only to disappear around corners. Others claimed they woke up in different rooms than the ones they'd fallen asleep in, with no memory of how they got there. A few even insisted, in hushed and fearful tones, that they'd briefly transformed into animals, only to snap back to human form moments later. I started to wonder if the hotel itself was some kind of supernatural nexus, a place where the barriers between our world and something else were thin. My research led me to local Native American legends about a place in these mountains where skinwalkers gathered to perform their rituals. A place where the veil between worlds was fragile. I couldn't help but wonder if Whisper Pines had been built on that very spot. As the weeks went by, I found myself changing. I was jumpier, more paranoid. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. I'd catch myself staring at my reflection, half expecting to see something else staring back. Sometimes, in the deepest parts of the night, I could swear I felt my body trying to shift, to change into something inhuman. Was I losing my mind? Or was prolonged exposure to whatever forces were at work in the hotel affecting me? The thought terrified me, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. It was like the hotel had its claws in me, drawing me deeper into its mysteries. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a full moon, and the hotel was unusually busy. A large group had checked in, all of them giving off that slightly off vibe I'd come to associate with skinwalkers. They gathered in the lobby, speaking in low tones, occasionally glancing my way with eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. As the night wore on, an eerie energy filled the air. I could feel something building, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. The skinwalkers grew more agitated, pacing the halls and staring out windows at the moon-drenched forest. Around midnight, they all left the hotel at once, heading for the woods. Part of me knew I should stay put, that following them would be incredibly dangerous. But my curiosity, my need to finally understand what was happening, got the better of me. I slipped out after them, following at a distance. They moved with inhuman grace through the trees, barely making a sound despite the carpet of dry leaves. I struggled to keep up without giving myself away, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure they must hear it. Finally, they reached a clearing. What I saw there will haunt me for the rest of my days. The skinwalkers had formed a circle in the moonlight. In the center stood Mrs. Blackwood, her silver hair loose around her shoulders, chanting in a language I didn't recognize. The words seemed to hang in the air, vibrating with power. One by one, the creatures began to shift. Bones cracked and reformed with sickening sounds. Skin rippled and changed texture, sprouting fur or scales. Human features melted away, replaced by those of wolves, coyotes, bears, and other beasts I couldn't even name. I'd watched in horror as Mrs. Blackwood's form began to change as well. Her body elongated, growing fur and claws. Within moments, a monstrous hybrid creature stood where she had been, part woman, part wolf, and all terrifying. The transformed skinwalkers turned as one, their glowing eyes fixed on the trees where I was hiding. They'd known I was there all along. This whole scene had been for my benefit, a warning or an invitation. I ran, faster than I'd ever run in my life. I could hear them behind me, their howls and growls growing closer. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, driven by pure terror. Somehow I made it back to the hotel, slamming and locking the door behind me. For hours, I huddled in the lobby, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, I half expected to find the parking lot full of monsters. Instead, I saw the group of guests calmly loading up their cars, Mrs. Blackwood chatting with them as if nothing had happened. She caught my eye and smiled. It was a predator's smile, full of secrets and threats. In that moment, I knew my time at Whisper Pines had come to an end. I quit that day, packed up my things and left town, trying to put as much distance between myself and that cursed hotel as possible. But I know it's not over. Sometimes, I wake up in the middle of the night, certain I can hear howls in the distance. I check my reflection obsessively, afraid of what I might see looking back at me. I don't know if I'll ever fully escape what I experienced at that hotel. The knowledge of what's really out there, hiding in plain sight, changes a person. I find myself watching strangers closely, looking for signs that they might not be entirely human. Every time I check into a hotel, I can't help but wonder what secrets it might be hiding. Part of me wants to forget it all, to convince myself it was just stress and an overactive imagination. But I know the truth. Skinwalkers are real. And somewhere in the mountains of New Mexico, there's a hotel where the boundary between our world and theirs is paper thin. I've thought about going public with my story, but who would believe me? And more importantly, what would the Skinwalkers do if I exposed their secret? I've read enough folklore to know that these creatures don't take kindly to having their existence revealed. So I keep quiet, carrying this burden alone. But I'm always watching, always wary. Because now I know that the person standing next to you in line, or the friendly face behind the hotel desk, might not be human at all. If you ever find yourself staying at a small mountain hotel, pay attention to the little details. Watch for the signs. And whatever you do, don't go into the woods at night. You never know what might be waiting there, wearing a human face. The experience at Whisper Pines Hotel has left an indelible mark on my life. Even years later, I find myself unable to fully shake off the memories of what I witnessed. Every full moon brings a sense of unease, a feeling that something out there is stirring. I've tried to move on, to build a normal life, but the knowledge I gained in those mountains colors everything I do. Sometimes, I wonder if I made the right choice in running away. Could I have done more to stop whatever the Skinwalkers were planning? Or would I have simply become another disappearance, another mystery for someone else to unravel? All I know for certain is that there's more to our world than most people realize. And somewhere out there, in a weathered old hotel surrounded by whispering pines, the veil between worlds remains thin. I can only hope that whatever forces are at work there stay contained, and that no one else stumbles into the nightmare I barely escaped. But if you ever find yourself in the mountains of New Mexico, and you come across a small hotel that seems just a little too quiet, a little too old, turn around, drive away, and don't look back. Because some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some doors are better left unopened. As for me, I'll keep watching the shadows, always aware that the line between our world and the world of monsters is far more blurred than we'd like to believe. And I'll never forget the lessons I learned during those long, terrifying nights at Whisper Pines Hotel. I never imagined I'd end up working at a place like New Haven Hotel. It was supposed to be a temporary gig to help pay my way through college, nothing more. The job seemed simple enough: night desk clerk at a budget hotel on the outskirts of town. I figured it'd be boring but easy money. Man, was I wrong. From the moment I stepped through those automatic sliding doors for my first shift, something felt off about the place. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first, just a vague sense of unease that settled over me like a heavy blanket. The lobby was your typical cheap hotel affair. Worn carpet in an ugly geometric pattern, fake plants gathering dust in the corners, a few sagging armchairs that had seen better days. But there was something else, a heaviness to the air that made it hard to breathe. It was like the whole building was holding its breath, waiting for something. I tried to shake off the feeling as I got the rundown from the day shift clerk, a tired-looking woman named Carol who seemed eager to get out of there. She showed me the basics: how to check guests in and out, where the extra towels were kept, what to do in case of emergency. Pretty standard stuff. But there was an edge to her voice, a nervousness in her eyes that I couldn't quite place. When I asked if there was anything else I should know, she hesitated for a moment before shaking her head. "Just keep an eye out," she said cryptically before hurrying out the door. Those first few weeks were uneventful enough. The night shift was predictably slow. Just the occasional late check-in or drunken guest locked out of their room. I spent most of my time surfing the internet or working on homework, grateful for the easy money. But slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, strange things started happening. It began with room 237. About a month into my job, I was reviewing the guest logs when I noticed something odd. According to the system, that room had been continuously occupied for nearly 2 years. At first I thought it must be a glitch, but when I asked my manager about it, he just shrugged it off. Said some people like extended stays, and as long as the bill was paid, it wasn't our business. But something about it nagged at me. I started paying more attention to room 237 after that. It was on the second floor, at the very end of the hallway. From my spot at the front desk, I had a clear view of the elevator and stairwell. In all my shifts, I never once saw anyone enter or leave that room. The only sign anyone was in there at all was the occasional room service tray left outside the door. As the weeks went by, more oddities piled up. Guests would complain about strange noises in the night, scratching sounds in the walls, footsteps in empty rooms above them. Several times I got calls about weird smells, like something rotting. But every time I'd go to investigate, there'd be nothing out of the ordinary. The housekeeping staff started acting strange too. I'd overhear them whispering in huddled groups, falling silent when I walked by. More than once I saw one of them come running out of a room, white-faced and shaking. When I asked what was wrong, they'd mutter something about bad energy and refuse to go back in. And always, there was that closed door of room 237 looming at the end of the second-floor hallway. It became a constant presence in my mind, a mystery I couldn't solve no matter how hard I tried. I started doing some dating, checking old records and talking to the longtime staff. Turned out the guest in 237 had checked in exactly 2 years ago to the day. A woman, mid-30s, unremarkable appearance according to the check-in notes. Paid in cash for a month up front, and then just never left. The weirdest part was how the other staff talked about her, or rather, didn't talk about her. It was like bringing up room 237 triggered some kind of mental block. They'd go blank for a second, then quickly change the subject. Even my manager, usually a chatty guy, would clam up when I tried to ask about it. But I couldn't let it go. I became obsessed with uncovering the mystery. I'd linger in the hallway near 237 during my rounds, straining to hear any sound from within. I'd scrutinize the room service orders, looking for clues. But there was never anything out of the ordinary, just standard hotel fare, 3 meals a day. One night, about 6 months into my time at New Haven, things took a turn for the weird. It was around 3 a.m., the deadest part of the night shift. I was half dozing at the desk when suddenly all the lights in the lobby flickered. For a split second, the air seemed to thicken, making it hard to breathe. And then everything was back to normal. Shaken, I decided to do a quick patrol of the hotel. Everything seemed fine on the first floor. But as I climbed the stairs to the second floor, that feeling of wrongness intensified. The air felt colder, heavier somehow. And there was a smell, faint but unmistakable, like wet earth and decay. As I rounded the corner into the hallway where room 237 was located, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, at the far end of the corridor, was a figure. It was hard to make out details in the dim light, but it seemed to be a woman. She was facing away from me, standing perfectly still in front of room 237. My heart was pounding as I called out, asking if she needed help. But she didn't respond, didn't even move. Slowly, cautiously, I started walking towards her. With each step, that feeling of wrongness grew stronger. By the time I was halfway down the hall, I was fighting the urge to turn and run. Just as I was about to reach her, she turned. I caught a glimpse of a pale, gaunt face and eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. And then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. Vanished, like she'd never been there at all. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the empty spot where she'd been. Part of me wanted to knock on the door of 237 to demand answers. But a deeper, more primal part of me knew that would be a terrible mistake. Whatever was in that room, it wasn't human. I practically ran back to the lobby, my mind racing. I tried to tell myself I was just tired, that I'd imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew better. Something was very, very wrong at New Haven Hotel. After that night, things escalated quickly. The weird occurrences became more frequent, more intense. Guests reported seeing shadowy figures in their rooms, hearing whispered conversations in empty hallways. Several people checked out in the middle of the night, leaving behind rambling notes about evil presences and hungry spirits. The staff was affected too. People started quitting left and right, often without notice. Those who stayed became jumpy, paranoid. More than once I came on shift to find my coworker huddled behind the desk, muttering about eyes in the darkness. Through it all, room 237 remained occupied. The room service orders kept coming, regular as clockwork. But now there was something different about them. The food choices became stranger, rawer. Whole raw chickens, plates of uncooked meat. Once, a room service tray came back with what looked disturbingly like teeth marks in the china. I knew I should quit, should run as far from New Haven as I could. But I was in too deep. I had to know the truth, no matter the cost. It all came to a head about 8 months into my employment. I was on my usual night shift when the fire alarm went off around 3 a.m. As I was helping evacuate guests, I realized this might be my chance to finally see the occupant of 237. I waited by the emergency exit, watching as sleepy travelers filed past. But she never appeared. When the all-clear was given and guests started heading back inside, I made a split-second decision. I told my coworker I was going to do one last sweep of the second floor, then sprinted up the stairs. The hallway was deserted as I approached room 237. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. With a shaking hand, I raised my master key to the lock. But before I could insert it, the door swung open on its own. The room beyond was pitch black, darker than seemed possible. For a moment, I thought it was empty. Then I saw her, a pale, gaunt face floating in the darkness. Her eyes locked with mine, and I felt a chill run through my entire body. In that moment, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. This wasn't just some reclusive guest. There was something deeply wrong here, something beyond human understanding. The woman, if you could call her that, smiled, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. And then she began to change. Her form seemed to ripple and shift, like a mirage in the desert. One moment she was human, the next something else entirely, a creature of shadows and hunger, with too many limbs and eyes that burned like coals. I caught glimpses of other shapes within her, faces screaming in silent agony, bodies twisted and broken. I don't remember running away, but somehow I found myself back at the front desk, shaking and drenched in sweat. I tried to tell my coworker what happened, but the words wouldn't come out. It was like my brain was actively fighting against remembering what I'd seen. The rest of that night passed in a blur. When my shift ended, I went straight home and fell into a fitful sleep plagued by nightmares. Twisted visions of dark hotel rooms and hungry, shifting shapes pursued me through my dreams. I called out sick the next night and the night after that. I couldn't bring myself to go back, but on the third day, my manager called. Said if I didn't show up, I'd lose my job. I needed the money, so reluctantly, I went in. Everything seemed normal at first. Same old tired lobby, same old boring shift. But as the night wore on, I became aware of presence. Like someone, or something, was watching me. The feeling grew stronger as the hours passed, until it was almost unbearable. Around 2 a.m., I noticed something on one of the security camera feeds. A dark shape, moving at the edge of the frame. I flipped through the different cameras, trying to track it, and then I saw her. The woman from 237 was in the stairwell, climbing with an unnatural, jerky gait. As she got closer to the camera, I could see her face clearly for the first time. Her skin was gray and waxy, stretched tight over prominent bones. But it was her eyes that truly terrified me. Black, empty voids that seemed to drink in the light. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything. But I was frozen in place, unable to look away from the monitor. She was coming closer, closer. And then the feed cut out, just static. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the snowy screen. Eventually, I became aware of a presence behind me. Slowly, I turned around. She was there, standing just a few feet away. Up close, I could see that her skin wasn't just pale. It was translucent, with a network of dark veins visible underneath. Her mouth opened, revealing those terrible teeth. But she didn't attack. Instead, she spoke, not with words, but directly into my mind. Images and sensations flooded my consciousness, overwhelming me with alien thoughts and memories. I saw the true nature of New Haven Hotel, not just a building, but a living, hungry thing. A trap for the unwary, feeding off the energy of its guests. And the creature before me was its avatar, its way of interacting with our world. She showed me others like her, spread across the globe. Ancient, patient things, slowly gathering power. Preparing for something big. As suddenly as it began, the flood of information stopped. I found myself on the floor, gasping for breath. When I looked up, she was gone. I don't know how I got out of there. My next clear memory is of driving home at breakneck speed, tears streaming down my face. I quit my job the next day, citing a family emergency. I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone what really happened. Who would believe me? It's been years now, but I still have nightmares about New Haven Hotel. Sometimes I'm tempted to go back to see if room 237 is still occupied. But deep down, I know the truth. Whatever was in that room wasn't human, and it's still there, waiting. I've tried to move on with my life, to forget about what happened. But every now and then, I'll catch a glimpse of a pale face in a crowd, or hear about a strange disappearance at a hotel, and it all comes rushing back. I don't know what that thing was, or why it chose to reveal itself to me. All I know is that there are things in this world beyond our understanding. Dark, hungry things that lurk just out of sight, waiting for their chance to strike. So if you ever find yourself staying in a hotel and notice something off about one of the rooms, or a guest who never seems to leave, don't investigate. Don't let your curiosity get the better of you. Because once you've seen what's behind that door, there's no going back. As for me, I've sworn off hotels altogether. These days, I stick to camping when I travel. At least out in the woods, I can see the monsters coming. But sometimes, on dark nights when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear whispers. Hungry whispers calling me back to New Haven Hotel.